Unable to find any of himself in the child, Deicide settled on the darkness he could see, the carnal leftovers from a time before civilization, when a man could easily be mistaken for an ape. Many would call this instinct, others a will to power. A deluded few would deem it original sin, but Deicide called it potential. He watched as the child's pupils opened wide as his new lord peered inward to the core of the child's psyche. Not and her team of scientists were unable to explain the hold that Deicide had on beings that possessed the baser of human traits. People who would develop a strong taste for vice and ruination, cruelty and malice. He was able to view these attributes as easily as one saw a mole on the face of another. Deicide handed the baby over his shoulder without looking back and into the arms of a staff member he knew would be there. The child would be raised as a member of his army, the Deathless Array. Made up of artificially enhanced soldiers, they were suited in an armor called a skid. It was as thin and flexible as a warm-up suit, yet still able to withstand an onslaught by modern weapons. The Deathless Infantry were known to fight only with their hands because of their superior strength, or with the alien weaponry known as the spine blade, sheathed inside the crevice that rode along the center of a soldier's back. Created from inert vestige material, the black blade solidified when it was unsheathed from the railing along the soldier's vertebrae. Every time it was drawn, its edge was sharpened to perfection. Along with the ground and aerial armor divisions, they were a vicious force that steamrolled every form of opposition they had ever come across. World wars and intergalactic skirmishes came to swift truces when the Yolapile broke into their realities. Deicide's presence had a way of spreading unity amongst his enemies. Wealthy merchants and politicians who cared only for their livelihoods the day before the Yolapile descended suddenly found new perspectives once it had. Religions, some thousands of years dead, were revived with a new vigor. Sermons and masses were given in the street as the earth was subjugated. Deicide strode between the columns of stone-faced refugees as they marched toward their new existence as a number in his machine. He was stopped again by a pleading family. His face became a mask of apathy. A child grabbed the bottom of the black cloak wrapped around Deicide's neck and shoulders. As the boy turned the material over in his hand, the cloth began to bleed a writhing black ooze. The creature emitted a choir of unintelligible whispers as a pair of yellow eyes emerged from this black oil and took hold of the boy with its tentacles. The boy's father lunged toward Deicide. Deicide's living cape began to emit thousands of feminine giggles as the needle tentacles began to bleed from her perimeter. With only a thought, Deicide held his creature at bay as the father was accosted by Deicide's risk eaters, military police who upheld the law on board the Yolapile and held authority over district and civil servants. Deicide narrowed his brilliant eyes. His irises were like diamonds. Deicide approached the man. The alien creature, now out of its dormant state, bubbled and screeched from his shoulders. It seemed to possess some level of sentience. Its chatter disturbed the onlookers, already shaken by the deathless attack. "The war is over, old man. Accept fate," Deicide said. His veins were black with the vestige that ran through his system. The man continued to look at Deicide with hate in his eyes, not realizing Deicide could snatch his spine through his chest like a bone plucked from a sardine. Deicide glanced over the man's body. He was old, but he looked strong, especially fit for his age. He sighed and ran a tongue over his edged teeth. "Release him," Deicide said. His voice reverberated through the chests of those surrounding him. Deicide removed the black creature from his shoulders. It protested this separation and wailed as he tore her from his uniform. This seemingly sentient creature was known as the Abyss, unexplainable and deadly. She added to the mythos surrounding the noble. In his youth, this creature had manifested itself as Deicide's shadow, whispering threats and taunting his enemies. But as he grew, so did his bothersome shade. Before Deicide had reached adulthood, she had manifested herself into the physical world, acting as an extension of his limbs and an indicator of his temperament. Most knew to avoid the captain when the abyss's oily blackness began to churn. No longer draped by his guardian, it enabled the masses to see that Deicide had two appendages running from his lower back like two black tails, umbilicals that ran through small portals which folded space. They were connected to a fully automated life support system inside the Yola pile. They were a more organic, less clandestine version of his soldiers' plug units. They were lined with a skin-like material, wafting behind him like two serpents. The old man before Deicide licked his cracked lips, then quickly removed his thick coat and gripped his blade. He surged toward Deicide like a dart and entered his kill box. It was otherworldly, a plane where cosmic law could be altered or rewritten. Bindings that had held mortals since the beginning of all were less than a trifle to one who had mastered their own sovereignty. The man seemed unnerved at Deicide's laxity as he moved freely about the space, while his own steps were measured and slow as Deicide pressed his will against the man without touching him. The knife rattled in the old man's weathered and dusty hands. The older man took a few more steps, and then the knife fell hard through the dusty earth, leaving a tiny hole. The man's breath was intensely labored, and his knees looked as though they would buckle at any moment. Deicide continued to increase the gravity inside the kill box. The man paused. His eyes were wet, and his teeth clenched, shoulders sagging as he had just relieved Atlas of his internal duties. Deicide nodded slowly as the man collapsed to his knees. He crossed the space between them and crouched down beside the old man's ear. The abyss returned to Deicide in a high arc, folding herself around Deicide's neck and shoulders, pooling her extraneous length around his feet until most of his body was encased in liquid darkness. Soldiers behind Deicide stepped back to avoid touching the alien fabric. You can allow me to save you, or I can have you separated into materials that will be of more use to me," Deicide said, grinning wide, wearing the ominous smile of an ancient wolf god. The abyss began to emit childlike giggling and hushed, mocking voices. The man could hardly breathe. You're a monster," the man said. He released a long, sour breath. Deicide's nostrils flared as the scent met the membranes inside his nose. He was always encouraged to breathe through his umbilicals when off the ship, even if there was breathable air. The smell of the man's breath told him the ingredients of the man's last few meals, and that he was in poor health after being subjected to Deicide's sovereignty. He would never make it through the indoctrination process now, Deicide thought. Why does he hate us?" the man said, letting his chin fall on his chest. Deicide squeezed the old man's shoulders. "I'm sure it's not hate, old boy," Deicide said. "He just doesn't care enough to stop it." Deicide stood and then bellowed down to the old man. "Your answer," Deicide said. The man nodded, and Deicide shrank his kill box down to his person and turned away. He hoped this display would encourage other humans to join him without the need for further violence. It was far easier to control the civilian population when they had been indoctrinated into the culture of the Yolapile. Those that had become full citizens would quickly learn that their new master was somewhat merciful. It was much better option than to be antagonized by his military police, forced to live in the urban entanglements of the lesser districts. A forest of skyscrapers and high-rises, all centered around an immense power plant that supplied the Yolapile and the Deathless with constant flow of energy. Each district was the metropolitan embodiment of the world its people were taken from. Each one sat upon a metal disk far less than the size of their home planet. Each civilization stacked onto or adjacent to one another. Housing, residential and industrial, was provided through construction machines loaded with artificial intelligences. Once the city was established, it was up to its residents to manage it through local governments and civil servants, with assistance from those acting as law enforcement overseers, the risk eaters. If a district seemed to be failing, those who applied for asylum were escorted through the apartheid gates that separated each city. There, they would be allowed to continue work in another power plant or whatever their chosen profession. A failed district was then shuffled from its position and down into a place called the Fringe Zone, or the Fringes. There, it was to become whatever the residents chose. A select few, ran by organized crime syndicates, thrived in the fringes, but most became rotted and forgotten ghettos, where violence was commonplace to all those within.